All right, I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the NFB Review Board for Tuesday, February 24th, 2026. Nolan, will you please call roll?
Hollander.
Here.
Fredrickson.
Here.
Mergia.
Here.
Bassett.
Here.
Stemple.
Here.
Fantastic. Can I please get a motion to excuse absent members?
Yeah, so moved.
Support.
All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none. We can move into item B, adoption of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
So moved.
Support? Anyone?
Support.
Support. Excellent. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? Hearing none. Moving on to item C, approval of the minutes. Looking for approval of the minutes from the Natural Features Protection Review Board meeting on January 27th, 2026. Let's see, are there any amendments or comments related to the draft meeting minutes from the January 27th, 2026 NFP meeting minutes? Okay, so I'm hearing no. Can we get a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Support.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
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 All right, any opposed? Okay, hearing none. Item D, public comments. If there are any general public comments from the public, please come forward, state your name. You have 3 minutes to address the board. I don't see anyone here. Do you want to check for call-in comments as well? Okay.
We'll just give it a second here. All right, no call-in comments.
All right, thanks, Nolan. Moving on to board member comments. Are there any comments from the board? Okay. The next item is new business, board offices. And then there's an opportunity to provide public comment on this specific agenda item. Do we,
Yep,
does that usually happen at the end, Nolan? Right.
happens for each item. There's
Okay.
also the general public comment period, which we just had. So
Okay.
I don't see anybody in person, but I can check the phones again just to see.
All right, thank you.
Okay, no phone-in comments.
All right, would you mind providing some background on this new business item?
Yeah, sure. So this one's pretty simple. So the NFP board has 2 board officer positions. It's the chair and the vice chair. And every year we're supposed to elect a new chair, vice chair. Sometimes it's the same year to year. This year's a little different since I'll spoil item further down the line here, but we do right now have an active board application for the NFP. And I was able to have a short interview with them, and they're still interested, and we haven't, I didn't scare them off. And that we'll talk a little bit more about that for our second action item with the nominating committee. But so the reality will be that Kyle Martin will finally term off, and he is currently serving as chair. Director Fredrickson is the vice chair right now, which is why they're filling in for Director Martin. So in reality, the board chair is just the one that facilitates the meeting from for the chamber in partnership with me as the liaison, which you guys have seen Director Martin do. And the vice chair's role is simply just to fill in if, for whatever reason, the chair has a conflict of interest or is unable to, fulfill their duties as chair. So And I know we have two, obviously Director Martin's not here and Director Rowe is not here either, but I wanted to open it up to discussion and see who might be interested in being in either one of those roles. And Director Fredrickson, you can also, if you want to stay as vice chair, you can, but we just do this, every year. It's not super difficult. I try to come as prepared as possible so that it's, fairly easy to kind of administer the duties of the board. So, but I'll open it up to comment and see if anybody's interested.
Well, I was let Nolan know I'd be happy to step into the chair role if anyone else is not interested. But as he said, it's something anyone can do. So whoever is, wants to fill the role, I can help. But I can obviously step back also, so someone else can have the opportunity to do that as well.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in and fill one of the roles if no one else is chomping at the bit for it.
You're more happy than I am, I think. I'd be happy too as well, but it seems like you're jumping at it, so appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay.
Everybody else?
And like I said too, we have lots of resources in my department. We can do more trainings if you guys want. So no worries there. We're always happy to talk shop, I guess. I'll fully admit it's not always the most engaging subject to talk about things like Robert's Rules of Order or the administration of a board, but it is interesting because it's something a lot of people don't get a chance to engage with. So that's just throwing that out there too. So we've got plenty of resources to help. And so moving forward with this too, real quick, when you make the motion, you just, basically the motion is for board member X to be chair and board member Y to be vice chair. And then we would do, someone makes the motion, support, and then we would we'll just do a roll call vote like we would for a normal action item, so.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to make a motion then to recommend Director Fredrickson as chair and Director Stemple as vice chair for 2026.
Support.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, skipping my duties here. Any final discussion items from the board? Good, okay. We need a roll call vote for this. Nolan, will you please call roll?
Yeah. Hollander?
Yes.
Fredrickson?
Yes?
Murgia?
Yes.
Stemple?
Yes.
Bassett?
Yes?
All right.
All right. All right, so the next item for new business is NFP nominating subcommittee. There's an opportunity to provide public comments for the specific agenda item. Are there any in-person comments? There's no one in the crowd. Nolan, will you check for call-in comments?
Yep. All right, no call-in comments.
Awesome. Nolan, can you provide us some background on this new business item?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, spoiled it before, but we did have an NFP board application come in, and I was able to sit down for half an hour with them last week and just gauge their interest still and kind of get a sense of why they wanted to volunteer, and just let them know that I'd get back to the board and we would go through looking at who would like to be on the nominating subcommittee. It's usually 3 board members that sit in on sort of it's informal or formal kind of interview, and then with the applicant, and then we'll take it back to the NFP board next month for a recommendation. That recommendation would be voted on by the board. and then it would go to the city commission for kind of final approval for them to be appointed. So that's kind of, it's a little drawn out through the process that we have, but they seem really interested. They have an architecture background working for Eckert and Wardell here locally, so that would actually kind of help balance our board a bit more too. So we would have three folks, kind of Director Hollander in the development world, Director Fredrickson in landscape architecture, and then we'd have an actual, building architectural background person to round out the 7-member group. So I think that would give us a really, we'd have all of our coverage that we need for the board in terms of expertise. And we've been trying very hard the past year or so to promote and reach out to folks to see who's interested. So yeah, I think I'll save space, at least for one of the board members on the subcommittee, to be Director Martin, who had thrown his hat in the ring. And since he's leaving or would be terming off the board, I thought it'd be appropriate we save at least one spot for him to participate, but then there's 2 open spots. And I know a couple of you reached out that you're interested, so this is just kind of similar for the board officers, though. When we make a motion, you just, come to agreement on who would want to be the other 2. So I'll open it up to everybody. I know a couple of you reached out.
I don't recall reaching out, but I might have. But I'm willing to do it. But if the couple that reached out would rather do it, that's fine too. So yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
I was one that reached out, and I'm happy to sit in on the interview process, depending on, I guess, as long as it works. I do have a busy March personally, so I'm not sure when or if it's even planned yet, but.
Not planned yet, but it would be virtual to provide maximum flexibility.
Sure.
Have to be in person.
Okay.
And we'd have some general questions, to ask and go through. For others who have been through the process, it's pretty simple, but
All right.
yeah. So
Okay. Can I get a motion to recommend board members Martin, Stemple, and Bassett to become a nominating committee to review applications in 2026?
So moved.
Support.
Any final discussion?
I will say that I reached out to a few people, and it turns out it's a little bit harder than I expected to get people excited about the board. But yeah, I have seen a lot, just in general announcements from the city saying, hey, there's board positions open. So I all kinds of board positions. So I think we tried as hard as we could. So I'm glad that we finally got somebody.
yeah, I'll say we're always looking for volunteers for our different boards and commissions, and it can be really difficult just given people's schedules and people are busy. This one in particular can be tough because we are generally looking for this certain background, although even if, somebody could have come with a different background and it would have been okay. They don't need to, we have all the expertise areas covered right now. But we do often get people with the correct background who are interested in this. But yeah, keep sharing those opportunities because we want to let people know that they're out there. And yeah, I'm happy that we got an application and they seem very interested and excited. So.
All right, great. We're going to need a roll call vote for this. Nolan, will you please call roll?
Hollander,
Yes.
Fredrickson,
Yes.
Mergia,
Yes.
Stemple,
Yes.
Bassett.
Yes.
All right, agenda item G, unfinished business. Looks like there is none. The next agenda item, staff reports and updates. Looks like Nolan's going to give us an update on the NFP annual report.
Yeah, so I started this, I think, last year and wanted to keep doing it. Had a little bit of a delay getting to the board this year. I wanted to try and get it to you guys in January, but And even now, I'll probably come back in March with some greater detail because this is still pretty high level. But I wanted to at least go over some things and recognize what's happened in 2025. So I will try to keep us on pace, but you can always stop me during the presentation to ask questions. So starting off here. So a lot of you guys already know, but for anyone who's listening, you know, I like to go over this every time, but what is NFP? The joke is that it's zoning, which it is, it's zoning. It's a little different mechanism, being an overlay district, which is extra standards that are laid on top of the existing zoning district beneath that overlay. And they're focused on, of course, you guys know, wetlands and water resources, protected tree species, national heritage areas and rare species, woodlands, slopes that are greater than 20% grade. And then there's other standards within the NFP that are covered through our site plan review process a lot of the time, or our soil erosion and soil control permit. So things like stormwater, and there's also development standards. So we have certain things like landscaping. We have things like lighted signs that are in the NFP. And the NFP is there to act as a guide for site development. And it's really meant to balance the impacts to a property that has existing natural features and the growth and development within the city. Again, really focusing on wetlands, water resources, trees, woodlands, slopes, everything I mentioned before. And this puts us a little bit in different territory than normal ordinances like this. So oftentimes, community will have something, maybe just like a tree ordinance, which has often been challenged in court, or it can be. And that's generally what happens there, is that you see communities like copy and paste a very generalized template of what a tree ordinance should be without much guidance. And they just take it into their community, and then it inevitably will end up getting challenged. What puts NFP apart from something like that is that it was designed over 1 or 2 years with technical expertise from the community and from people in your fields to help develop it. And I think that really puts it into a different category. We've also had lots of success with implementation of NFP. It's been hard, but you know, this type of board administration can be really difficult. But I think it's borne out over time as a successful ordinance that we've been generally able to implement and meet the intent of NFP, which again is really to minimize those impacts to the extent possible. And I mentioned it a little bit, you guys already know, but each of you serve two-year terms, and you can serve 2 terms back to back. You're appointed by the mayor and city commission, which that process I kind of outlined is, you know, normally someone puts their application in, there's an interview process, the board makes a recommendation to city commission, goes to city commission for final approval. And we're always wanting to keep these red boxes on the board, which makes it tough. Specifically things like anybody with a professional geology background is hard. Especially site development and building can be difficult as well, because those folks are also often running their own businesses or working on other projects, which can make volunteering in that type of role very difficult. As well as, you know, anyone with the ecology and biology background and the hydrology background. There's lots of field work that happens that can interrupt schedules for something like this. So, you know, full appreciation for the board members that are on NFP right now for balancing your professional life with serving on this board. And then I'd like to highlight that, you know, generally for the public, if we have those 4 slots filled, and normally we have more than that, anybody with any background is welcome to apply. It shouldn't scare anybody away that it's all focused on natural features. If you're a social worker, but this is something you're really interested in or passionate about, and you want to apply, go ahead and apply. And that's the same for any of our boards that aren't looking for like a specialized, type of background. So as an example, another board that we have is one of our historic boards requires, an architect, and that can be really difficult to fill. And then there's all of you. Yes, I did find all these, yeah.
I just have a question. Can you remind me is it this specific board or is it all city boards that you do not need to be a resident
So
for every board?
for this board, you don't have to be a resident.
Right,
There are
okay.
some where you do need to be a resident of the city.
Okay.
Yep, and that's usually, when you go to apply for a board online, there's generally guidance on the little questionnaire that you fill out to, for that. But yeah, I think if we limited it to ourselves, to just within the city, we would really have a difficult.
Tough.
Now, I will say, all of our members, for the most part, are within the county. So everybody at least works and lives and plays within Kalamazoo County. And so, yeah, that's varies by board, but this one in particular has that flexibility. Of course, I tried to find all the good headshots. But this is our current makeup. I like to use this too to highlight to people, who we have in their background so far. If I got anybody's background wrong, you can throw a tomato at me or something, that's fine. But it really is, very interesting where everybody's coming from, which is why when Director Rowe applied, I thought it was very interesting that we have an entomologist now, which is not something everybody thinks about every day. I see the potato bugs in my house and they make me angry, but anyway. I'm going to jump ahead real quick before we get into that. So for the board, this is something that gets, that kind of props up every once in a while, but where does NFP fall within the boards and commissions that community planning and economic development has right now? Like, where does it fall into that hierarchy? And this is actually a slide from the joint board training that we had this past year, which kind of outlines where NFP falls. So obviously, city commission is at the top, and then we have our city manager, who is the executive for the city organization. So basically my boss's boss. And then you have our department, and within our department, we have a couple divisions. I know we got a lot of differing terms here, but so we have the department is the big umbrella, and then the different divisions, which are building and trades, community development, housing, and economic development. NFP falls under planning and zoning, and the planning and zoning staff are working within the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Planning Commission, our Historic District Commission, and the Natural Feature Protection Review Board. You guys will probably never really encounter or have to interact with the Historic District Commission. That's kind of a special, we might have some properties that are in the historic district. I'd have to actually go and look, but we haven't had one pop up yet. So, and then the Planning Commission. So if there's any ordinance changes to NFP or we update the map, those types of requests will go to Planning Commission for approval, and then, before they would move on to like the City Commission. So as an example, when we were doing all the NFP Phase 2 mapping, which was updating the map and adding more parcels and doing that type of work, that inevitably had to go to Planning Commission for approval before going to City Commission for final approval. So those are bigger like zoning ordinance changes. And then the Zoning Board of Appeals, which NFP does interact with, broadly in terms of we have seen variances come through. and that we'll talk through that process. And then planning staff as a whole, we have different board liaisons for each of these boards. So you've seen Mr. Eldridge at NFP meetings before. He's our zoning administrator, and he's the staff liaison for the ZBA. You guys have met Bobby Durkee, who's our planner, who is the planning commission liaison, and then I'm the liaison for NFP.
Hey, Nolan, question on this. Can you clarify, like, the order that something would go through these different boards?
Yeah, I was gonna jump to that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On this next one.
On the same page, thank you.
And this is a very, very simplified version of this. But generally, NFP interacts with our site plan review process. We've talked about that before. That's generally where projects are, come to the board, and the board will review them. Sometimes you'll see them before they get to site plan, and that's when they're looking for a variance request. So if they're looking for a variance request, or maybe during discussions with staff, they say, hey, this looks like we might not be able to do what we're trying to do without a variance type of request. Generally, staff will try to work with that applicant first to look at talk them through or try to help them understand, do you really need the variance? Is it something that, is there another workaround? Is there another layout for the site? What else can you explore? The balancing act we play is that we're not telling them how to develop a project. They have to do some of their homework too and look at their site and understand the ordinance. And we provide them code references and things like that to help them out. If they still want to move forward with a variance request, then it would go before NFP first for a recommendation, or sometimes it's not recommended, right? Even if it's not recommended, they can still make the decision to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, who have the final say on that variance request in terms of approval. So that all has to happen before anybody can get to site plan review. If we have a project that doesn't need a variance, and they're just looking to start site plan approval, and they understand after talking with staff, yep, NFP board approval will be needed for full site plan approval, which means if they don't get approval from you guys, they don't get full site plan approval, which means they can't get their permits or anything else. So if they don't need a variance, they just start that process, and they will go through our development process. And when they start site plan review, then they can come to the board. And usually after, a couple of our development meetings, their plans have coalesced a little bit more. They have a little more, meat on the bones to say, like they've got more detail, which is what you guys are used to seeing. And they come for board approval. And as they continue, so say they get board approval, but they're still going through our site plan process, as our site plan review committee reviews a project, they'll be making revisions, and I'm monitoring the revisions to ensure they're still, they haven't changed something. So say someone like the fire marshal says, I need a fire access lane here where they were gonna preserve trees. If there's something that triggers like, hey, this is enough of a change, then they might have to come back to you guys for approval again, or at least to look it over. So I'm monitoring the projects as there's revisions coming in to make sure, does this meeting the threshold of enough of a change, or are they still within what they were approved for? So we haven't really had something meet the threshold yet where it's got to come back, at least in recent memory. Obviously, recent memory, we've had some variances come through. Actually, in 2025, I think we've had less variances come through than previous years. But every time we have a project come through, we're looking at how is the process working, and are there areas of friction where we might need to understand, does the process need to get tweaked a little bit here and there? And that's not necessarily to make it easier for a developer coming through our process, but we want them to be as prepared as possible to understand what's coming forward and what they need to do and what their role is and what city staff's role is, and what your role is as a board, right? I think you guys all as a board do a good job of staying very grounded in what the ordinance is looking at, right? So that is very high level, the normal process. The other process that can occur is the administrative review process. And this is a little different in the sense that on the NFP application, if you were to look at it, basically it asks a question on page 1. It says, are you only doing work in the interior of a structure, or are you not having, or basically not going to have any ground disturbance? So there are particular instances where something doesn't have to come before the board and it's an admin review. In that case, this is what the process would look like. Even if they, they might still need a variance. Sometimes that happens. The process still remains the same, so you guys could see it, as a project come through if they need a variance related to NFP. That's very rare. I don't think that happens very often. What these projects usually end up looking like are, as an example, there's a cell tower that currently exists somewhere in the city. It's usually on a parcel that cell tower was built maybe at the rear of a property near the creek or a forested area. It's all fenced in, and AT&T or another company wants to add more equipment to that tower. In that case, it's effectively they're just doing work within the interior of the fenced area is how it's interpreted. It's also for projects that might not necessarily need site plan review. So another example is someone has a garage and it's built a little into a sloped area. Maybe they have an existing retaining wall, and they're tearing that garage down and they're just going to replace it with a new garage in the very same footprint. Well, in that case, they're not needing site plan review, and I'm just going to do an administrative review to make sure they're not expanding that dimension of the garage, which could trigger a more in-depth review. But if they're just replacing what is pre-existing and not expanding it, they should be okay. And I'm looking at whatever plan sheets are submitted and working with our building and trade staff to ensure compliance with NFP. So, as an example, we've got, projects that sometimes come through that maybe are just retaining walls or an existing structure getting replaced or a cell tower. We even had one of the projects that came through was Growler Stadium was going to be doing some renovations inside the stadium. And that is right next to the river and the forested area at Mayor's Riverfront Park. So that fell into admin review, even though it needed site plan review because it's all within the interior of the stadium. They weren't doing any exterior work. They weren't going to be touching any of the natural features in and around the complex. It's all just inside. So that's how the administrative review works. And those don't come in a ton, but they do come in. Okay. And then I'm going to jump into a little bit of ZBA and NFP stuff. So this is just the sheet or one of the sheets that our zoning administrator will use. And he's looking for more specific information about what variances are being requested related to NFP to keep the two boards kind of in lockstep with each other in terms of trying to understand what's being requested and in terms of relief. And I mentioned it before, the NFP board would make a recommendation or not, and the ZBA is that final decision-making authority. And the goal, I mentioned this, the goal for us as staff is we want to try and avoid variance requests. Sometimes there are, sometimes there are hardships where it's almost impossible to not impact something. Or, in the case with NFP, sometimes there's a natural feature where it's very difficult, and there might be a real hardship case there, but it's ultimately, the ZBA has that final authority. I will tell you guys all as board members, though, that they do take the recommendation from NFP. That carries weight. So I mentioned it earlier, an applicant, even if they're not given a recommendation in the affirmative by the NFP board, they can still bring it to ZBA. But there's not a very good likelihood that, they will have a positive outcome in terms of a ZBA voting result. And if that's the case, that could create issues in the terms that they can't really come back to the Zoning Board of Appeals for a while. So that's why we try to work with folks way, way ahead of time to try to understand everything before we get to a point where that occurs.
I have a question. When you say the goal is to avoid variances if possible, at what stage is that goal pursued by the city most aggressively? Is it before it comes to us, in working with the applicant, as you kind of figure out help them navigate the process? Is that where that happens for the most part?
Yeah, it's before. So it's during our pre-development process. We have a staff member, Jared Chambers, who usually he serves as like the first person that someone would talk to if they had a project idea for their property. And he would start to ask questions about, if it's NFP, I should probably get connected with Nolan and, start asking Pete questions. Then generally Pete and I will also hop in and meet with that person to understand and give them some background. And I think as terms of processes, we'll probably be looking at reviewing our processes for when projects are able to come forward. Generally, if they are giving enough detail or meeting enough, at least the minimum for what they need to have a complete application, they can move it forward. But it's up to staff to kind of interpret what it means to have enough to have a complete application. And that can sometimes will change based on previous experiences that we've had. So that can change. So the NFP application makes it very clear about what we'd like to see in terms of detail. And the ZBA really also needs a certain level of detail basically in order to make any type of determination. But the first step is always to try and have those conversations early on and see if a variance can maybe be avoided, which can be tricky, right? We're there basically to help coach, not to tell you how to do it, not to tell you put building there and not there. We're not doing their project. We're there to kind of help them and guide them through what the ordinance's requirements are. And that kind of leans into this example, right? So,
Sorry, everybody, I gotta go.
See ya. So, say you have a property that looks like this, right? These are the topographic lines for the slope. And, as is, somebody put a building very close to the frontage of that property, and it's away from the slope, and somebody comes in and it's zoned commercial and they want to redevelop it into a larger retail space. But normally they could come in and based on, zoning and what's permitted by right, they might have a site design that looks very much like the one on the right, which is trying to maximize impervious coverage, maximize parking for a very small-ish in relation to the property retail space. And what the NFP is trying to do, right, in this case, if this were an NFP property, they would need a variance, right? Because they're trying to maximize the impact as much as possible. And they would probably run into things like woodland, because a lot of times our protected slopes have other features associated with them. And so we are trying to work through with them and understand what other viable options they have for that development, which could be what looks like on the right? Minimizing the impact to the extent possible so that in that red circle, right, there's probably still a little bit of protected slope that might get impacted, and they might need a variance to impact that. But you can see they've reconfigured the building for that retail space and the parking and vastly reduced the impervious surface. And that is sort of what we mean for the outcomes and when we apply the intent of NFP. We really want to balance. You know, we don't want to say like, no, you can't develop that property, but, you know, how are you thinking about, you know, setting this property up in a different way than the conventional way, which is what you see kind of on the left. And so I think it's good to kind of view it. I like to view it like this because it makes sense of there are lots of projects that are still viable. You just have to think a little bit differently on how you apply, you know, your development to a site. Because otherwise we would have, you know, we'd probably have far greater numbers of sites that are clear cut and just, you know, regraded and everything. There are some properties that I guess to a certain extent will police themselves because they are just so difficult that, you know, there are a lot of things at play beyond just natural features that make it difficult to make them work. But yeah, you know, 50, 60 years ago, the name of the game would have been retail or commercial space way set back from the road with all the parking in a big parking lot, maximizing that space on that particular lot, which for NFP, that's why we low impact development, right? That's what we're shooting for. So still development, but low impact as much as possible, trying to minimize impacts to our natural features so that they can coexist with development like commercial or maybe more housing, things like that. Okay, I've jumped around a little bit. So back to ZBA real quick. And we'll probably go over some more of this later this year when we do some more joint board training. But Zoning Board of Appeals, it's a really interesting board. It's quasi-judicial. And its primary function is to make those decisions related to the zoning ordinance, right? So those are usually dimensional variances or a use variance. NFP is not really working with a use variance. That's mostly a dimensional variance. And that just means, you know, a variance that we're dealing with like something real kind of in space, like on the property itself. So like woodland and slopes and things like that. A use variance is kind of different. So they're basically granted the power to review and make a interpretation based on the finding of fact. And that's a very legal term. I'm not going to try and define it, but all this to say, this is very complicated work that this board does, and it interacts with NFP in different ways. So, yeah, so a use variance is request for relief from the permitted land use in the zone district. A dimensional variance is request from, you know, relief from development regulations or some other numerical standard. So that's the definition there. So with NFP, it's the development regulation or the numerical standard, like you could think of the preservation percentage for woodland as the numerical standard. So someone's like, I can't meet the 25%. I'm requesting, you know, a variance to only preserve 20. But there has to be, you know, a finding of fact or an actual, you know, deep reason why that request is being made. And what doesn't fly is, you know, things like, well, I just don't want to, you know, I just don't want to meet that requirement. I think 20 is better. no, what are the objective facts on the ground for why this is difficult to meet? So what is ZBA not? It's not a legislative body. That would be more of like the Planning Commission. Not a courtroom. They're not design consultants, which is somewhat similar to NFP, right? You guys are there to guide, and you give guidance on things like maybe a tree location or landscaping, but you're not, designing someone's entire project. And ZBA decisions are only limited to the request that's being made. So it's very limited in scope. So you can kind of think of it, they're very much putting blinders on and have to be very focused on what's being presented, which can be very difficult to do.
I have a question on a couple back. You don't have to go there. I can just, you mentioned it, ZBA being the purpose to consider both use and non-use variances, dimensional, whereas this board is not designed to really consider use variances, right? That's just not the function of this board. And so to what extent should this board consider the use, the intended use of a property then? Like, should it even come into our consideration, I guess? Because we're just looking at, the 8, pillars, or as it were, of the ordinance that we're interpreting.
Right.
And sometimes the use of the property does come up in these conversations, and I'm never quite sure if it's something that I should even, should come into my thinking, I guess, when I'm weighing decisions.
That's a good question, and I can reach out to the city attorney's office and get a better understanding of that. My sense would be that, the use variance is dealing with what's permitted for that zone district. And the NFP ordinance is really you're looking at what's defined in the NFP ordinance, which doesn't as much deal with the zone district, although when there's conflicts between the two, generally for an NFP property, the NFP overlay kind of overrides. So like landscaping is a good one, right? If there's a conflict between just the general landscaping requirements for a particular zone district and what is required with NFP, generally the NFP overlay district will get the greater weight. But that's a good question. I can ask about that. We don't see use variances, right? So the standards we have are strictly the standards we have. So I think I can ask about, how do the NFP board members navigate discussions around the use? I would say that you would stick to just interpreting around the standards within the NFP ordinance and not so much what the property is, its intended use is going to be.
I guess another way to think about it is a property has, zoned for a specific use. What I'm hearing you say is it's not incumbent upon us to assume that that's a right of the developer to, just because a property is zoned for a particular use doesn't necessarily mean that we need to make sure it gets used that way, or the use that is we need to accommodate that use just because it's zoned that way.
Yeah, I think that's correct way of thinking, because the NFP overlay is also citywide and it's over lots of different zone districts. And so it is really separate, so say, if someone's trying to build multifamily housing versus a commercial development, they still have to look at NFP sort of similarly, right? The use matters a little bit less. It's more about meeting these specific requirements within the NFP ordinance. Yeah. But that's a good question. I can ask about that and come back, because I would like to know a little more firmly too. And we can always, did a bad job at this last year, but I still think it would be good to maybe have some folks come and maybe give, it can be an interactive presentation, but have a chance for NFP to ask some questions. So maybe I can invite Mr. Charlie Bear, who's our one of our assistant city attorneys that helps us a lot with, he's at all the zoning board of appeals meetings, but he might be able to lend some more insight into that as well. So yeah, that's a good question. And then final thing, on how does the ZBA work. So I talked a little bit about it, but they're really, it's a very narrow scope, and they're reviewing the facts of each specific request. The zoning ordinance is basically what they're using through that lens, right? With NFP projects, they're also looking at the NFP recommendation kind of as a fact in the request being made. And, looking at the review criteria that Pete will, what he looks at for when something comes forward with a variance request is that, is there a hardship that's unique to the land or structure that's not applicable to other land or structures in the same zone district? Are there any special circumstances created by the actions of the applicant? Is the variance, the minimum action necessary to use that land or structure? Will the granting of a variance negatively affect adjacent land? And again, this kind of ties back to some of the stuff that Pete's also looking at when NFP projects come forward. But yeah, there are set criteria, and this is where us as staff are trying to help applicants understand. I mean, it's a hard balancing act, right? Because we're not telling them how to do their project, but we're trying to coach them through the ordinances and zoning to help them understand, have you explored other options? Is this your last resort? Because we don't want the default to be, well, NFP, I just get a variance. That's not what we're shooting for. That's not meeting the intent of NFP. We want people to think about how they're laying a project out. And that can be tough because it is a two-way street. But the NFP ordinance, also has a bit of teeth. So it's, I also think overall it's fairly lenient in some circumstances in terms of being able to meet those requirements. Usually there is a way to do it. Not always. Sometimes we have variances come through, but okay.
I have a question about this. So number 1 on there, depriving the applicant use of the permitted use. Just a curiosity question. How do you guys navigate the perceived use of the property? In the legal sense, I know what that means, but there's also the interpreted sense from like a developer based on like how much it's usually a return on investment calculation, right? So how do you guys go about making that judgment call with where that that deprivation line is, like their opinion of what the return on investment, what needs to fit on the site versus what you guys think does, and so then you can analyze whether they're going past the level of disturbance for a variance that you'd be comfortable with. Like, how do you guys like walk through that process?
That's a good question for our attorney's office that I don't have a good answer for. I'll say that we normally, our staff are really good at trying to meet people where they're at and understand what they're trying to do. I can't think of a lot of instances where like a project maybe goes to court over issues around that. But that's where our attorney's office might know better. I certainly can't think of NFP projects where that's occurred. But I think generally those are the types of things that are out of the purview of staff. You know, we are very narrow in our scope as well, as that, you know, I'm not thinking about an applicant's return on investment necessarily. I'm thinking about them meeting and adhering the NFP ordinance, also interacting with Pete and understanding, and us being clear with each other about where's the project at, what do they need, or what do we need to move them forward, and an applicant being prepared to come to the board, right? That's my role as a staff.
And
the ROI part is,
and don't get hung up at that. I was just using that as an example of how they usually will come to us saying, I need X, Y, and Z square footage of the site covered. And so then it's hard for us sometimes to have a conversation about, they make some design changes, but still, like, what percentage of disturbance is variance acceptable? You know what I mean? Like that line, and like maybe we can work like as a team to kind of start thinking about how we navigate that. Because that's what I meant by it. They come in with a preconceived notion, and then staff have a different preconceived notion of how much of the site needs to be filled. And then somewhere in the middle, we're trying to navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, so there's the balancing act of, I as staff, right? Or we as staff, we're not the ones making the decisions, right? So I create a staff report for a project, I bring it and share it with the board, and I have a recommendation within the staff report. The board doesn't have to follow my recommendation. It's simply a recommendation, right? So you all are the decision makers in terms of, project to project that comes through. It's very similar with Pete, right, with ZBA. They are the board, ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals, they're the ones making the decision. Staff are there to provide extra context or background or, help guide either a discussion around a certain topic or provide any clarity where I can. I'm not going to punch above my weight and try to speak for a legal team or anything like that. So that's kind of the check there, right? And in my staff report, I'm looking and reviewing the standards that we have in the NFP. We don't have a standard about return on investment. That is not something I think is within the purview of staff to consider.
Yeah, and I apologize if I got us off track with that term, but it's really more like they're disturbing 10%. Should they only disturb 5%? Like, what is that? Like, and it sounds like that's our discussion item, and that's perfectly fine. So. And
part of it too, I showed it right here. To create site designs that are responsive to the existing natural features and minimize impacts to the extent possible. So I think to the extent possible might be the way to look at it. But that's part of the burden, I think, of, as a developer, you're also there, a lot of these projects have complex funding sources, but that's not staff's job to help you through. If it's a BRA project, a Brownfield Redevelopment Authority project, then we do actually have a staff person that maybe is trying to help you with a Brownfield redevelopment application and plan, but that's a whole different world. At least for Pete and I, it's, our scope is for the ordinance that we're working with. And I'm not offended or anything. It's something that we provide the information, right, during the development process. And I think that's the two-way street of the developer is having to balance getting that information and understanding how they can configure things or how they can, that's up to them and their team.
Yep. That's cool. That's excellent. I'm actually really happy we talked about this because it kind of gives me some more clarity on where our role is and what we're doing here. So thank you.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor it anymore, but But the list here says review criteria for use variances. I mean, it implies that it's specific to that side of the ZBA. Is there also a similar review criteria for non-use variances, or is that something that we as a board, with the help of the city, can develop? Because I think what we're seeing here, I think we want that. So.
Yeah, I think there is, and I showed this sheet earlier too, there's some specific NFP related, this sheet in particular is something that was developed for ZBA as well, so Pete understands what the review criteria for any variance to NFP is. So it says right here, are there reasons the parcel cannot be reasonably utilized for its zoned use without the requested relief? Give specific project details, what standards are you requesting a variance from? And so there's criteria there for that review. I think I grabbed some of this from our joint board review, and I think Pete had put some use variance language in there, and I didn't think to update it to dimensional, but yeah.
It's similar, spurs the same thoughts, so thank you.
Okay, so 2025 in review, we got through all the meat there, but so I wanted to give kudos again to the board. You had all 12 months of the year, there was a meeting, and we didn't have any cancellations, which even in December, there were some troopers that came in December. I appreciate that for the special meeting. Those are rare, so don't expect that to happen all the time, because that's a great ask, and so, but appreciative of
Question
that.
on that one, Nolan.
Yeah.
The purpose of the special meeting, was there I can't remember, was there a timeline associated with the applicants?
So there was some of that. There was also just the fact that when we approved the board schedule back in January or December so when we approved the 2025 schedule, the board agreed, well, we probably won't meet in December because we're the fourth Tuesday in December.
Right, okay.
And trying to find another date and time in December can be tricky because other boards have their dates and times all set. Like to use this space. So I got lucky in the sense that there was a date and time available and there were board members available. If there wouldn't have been board members available, we wouldn't have been able to hold it. So there's just it's like a perfect storm of certain things that had to come together for us to hold it.
So it wasn't necessarily a timeline on the applicant side, aside from just wanting it done.
Yeah, I think they wanted to try and
move it along.
They wanted to try and get to ZBA, I think, in January.
Okay. It would have pushed
which is
back.
why, they would have been pushed.
Okay.
So when we try to accommodate, but if we wouldn't have been able to meet, if you guys were busy or there wasn't space available, there's not a lot we can, that's why we tried, and we just got a little bit fortunate that people were available. And there's an element of risk with that too, right? So there wasn't a full board for that meeting. Okay. And I'm going to get some more detail for this because this is very high level compared to last year. I only recently had one of our IT get me the data that goes a little deeper than this, but overall we had about 10 projects to the NFP board in 2025. I believe we had about 3 variance requests in 2025, 2 new board members, and then we had NFP ZBA Planning Commission joint training this past year, which I'm not sure everybody was able to. A few people were able to come, but we generally will do some type of joint board training during the year. It usually ends up towards the end of the year. So that's kind of broadly year in review. And I'm hoping at the next meeting to get a little deeper into some of the data, and then also go over the NFP guide, which I didn't have a whole lot of time to cover, but yeah, it's something I think I'll bring back to the March meeting.
Thank you. Nolan.
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. Next agenda item, communications and announcements. Any communications announcements from staff or board members?
No, just, I think just an FYI that we're still doing some master plan neighborhood meetings. So if you haven't had a chance, there's one tomorrow in Parkview Hills and Thursday in the North Side neighborhood. So you could always just come and be a fly on the wall if you wanted to. Yeah, I'll be there, so.
Excellent. All right, with that, we can adjourn. Meeting adjourned at 5:06.